And now for some introductions. Lydia Denworth is an award-winning science journalist. She's the contributing editor at Scientific American and the author of Friendship, The Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond, which was named one of the best leadership books of 2020 by two-time fan speaker Adam Grant. Lydia is also co-author with Dana Suskind of the New York Times bestseller Parent Nation. Dana also has appeared for Fan twice, and she's written 2 other books of popular science, I Can Hear You Whisper and Toxic Truth. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Time, many publications, and now let's settle in and listen.
Well, I appreciate those of you who came out and those who are watching by Zoom. You know, I was excited to just get to talk to anybody in person, frankly, at this point. So because this book, Friendship, came out in January of 2020. So y'all know what happened right after that. I spent 6 weeks on the road talking about it, and then the world shut down. But fortunately for me, this book actually met the moment because it spoke to the thing that we all were thinking about during the pandemic, not for ourselves and for our kids. And you know, what I wanted to start with tonight is the fact that I wrote this book. I'm a serious science journalist, Lonnie said. I write for Scientific American. I cover neuroscience and psychology. Why am I writing a book about friendship? A lot of people wondered. It's because the science was so interesting to me and it felt important and new and different. It felt deeper than what we thought we knew about friendship. It feels very familiar. We think we know all about it. I'm here to argue that we don't entirely. I also wanted to write this book because the more I learned about it, the more I thought it would affect the friendships in my own life. What I didn't understand was how much it would affect the friendships in my kids' lives. It's my older son Jacob on the right there, and his very best friend Christian. Jacob lives in Wrigleyville. I got to have dinner with him last night, which is another great reason for coming in person. So these two are true best friends. They're what we imagine when we think of that. They've known each other since they were 1. They call themselves best friends from 4. And while I was working on this book, you'll see and you'll hear tonight that one of the things that I talk about in the book a lot is other species and the fact that we found friendship or something like it in other species. And that's one of the things that told us how important it is, how universal it is, and how it's not just cultural. I went off to an island in Puerto Rico, spent a lot of time watching these rhesus macaques grooming and hanging out together with some of the premier evolutionary biologists of our time. Flew home to Brooklyn, and I found these two sitting on the couch playing NBA 2K as if they had never left in the entire week that I had been gone, because that is where they were when I left. I was upset. I was annoyed. I was finding all these video games really, really frustrating. And I started in with my, don't you boys have anything better to do? You're sitting here, you're doing nothing. And then it hit me. No, they're not doing anything. In fact, they looked remarkably like the monkeys I had just been watching, because look at the proximity. They were sitting right next to each other. They were bantering. They were trash talking and laughing and communicating. They were kind of doing the equivalent of the human equivalent of grooming, which is gold for monkeys, this hanging out and building a relationship. And it made me realize that I had just made a mistake that way too many of us make in our own lives and in our lives as parents. I had seen the video game and not the visceral connection between them. Not at all saying that kids should spend all their time playing video games, but what I am saying is that too often we miss what's social going on and what is important in our kids' lives. And here I was literally spending my days studying friendship, and I missed it. I didn't see it. It took me a while to figure it out. Here's the thing. We have known for decades that having one good friend is essential for children's well-being. But what's different now is that we understand biologically and evolutionarily why that is so. It's true for us too. And so the thing is that kids, they start early and their brains are teaching them how to be social. And they come by it naturally. In fact, all of us do. We have a fundamental need to belong. So back in 1993, two social psychologists named Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary developed what's known as the need to belong theory. And they realized that essentially belonging explained, it was a motivating factor for most of human behavior. They were able to tie an incredible amount of what we do to our desire to belong. And so they, there we go, okay, thank you. All right, great, thank you so much. So we all have that, but the thing is with our kids, we tend to talk to them about achievement, about their academics, about their extracurriculars. We don't actually talk to them in the same way so much about friendship. Maybe we want to hear about their friends, but we don't recognize it as something that they can get better at, and that there are skills involved, and that this is a project that has lifelong ramifications. Because what we learn about friendship, it matters at every age, but maybe never more than when we're young, because what we learn early helps us or hurts us in our lifelong endeavor of trying to be a good friend. And as you will see, it has ramifications for our whole lives. So it's not that we haven't appreciated friendship all this time. We have, all the way back to Aristotle and presumably before. We knew that it was a lovely, lovely thing and it added value to our lives. But we thought it was valuable but not invaluable, and we thought it was cultural. We attribute it to human civilization and maybe as a lovely byproduct of language and things like that. And it is cultural, of course, but it is also biological. That's what we didn't understand. What changed is that in the 20th century, first half of the 20th century, coronavirus notwithstanding, infectious disease became less of a concern. There was a big change in public health and medicine. Infectious disease was not the same concern that it had been because of the advent of vaccinations, sanitation, antibiotics, things like that. And what took over as the leading causes of death were things like cancer and heart disease. And those chronic diseases are not caused by viruses and bacteria, they're caused by the way people live their lives, in large part. So what scientists started to do was to ask or to follow thousands of people over long periods of time, trying to see if they could figure out what about the way people live their lives was a risk factor for these diseases. And one of the studies that did that, the first such study to recognize that actually one of the really interesting factors turned out to be people's social integration. So in those studies, it was sort of discovered by accident. They were looking at a lot of other things, what you eat, how much you exercise, stuff like that. But in 1979, some social epidemiologists looked at this data from Alameda County, California, thousands of people, and they discovered that the people at the start of the study who described their lives as having less social interaction, maybe they weren't married, they didn't see people very often, they were more likely to have died 9 years later in 1974. It was just a correlation, right? Two things that were true, but it was intriguing. And since then, many, many, many more studies have been done. And you're probably familiar with this, loneliness kills, right? In 2015, a meta-analysis collected data on 3.4 million people, and it showed that the risk of dying earlier went up by a quarter to a third for people who lived alone, who were lonely, or who were socially isolated. And you might wonder why loneliness and social isolation are separate things there. It's because they are not exactly the same thing. What we understand now is that social isolation is an objective measure of the amount of social integration, the size of your social network, the number of interactions that you have. Loneliness is a subjective measure of the mismatch between the amount of social connection you have and the amount you want. And I threw solitude up there just to acknowledge that sometimes being alone is a lovely thing, and that's the word we usually use to describe that. I myself like being alone some of the time. But this understanding, this pulling out of loneliness as being especially harmful was the real sea change in thinking here. But meanwhile, in Africa, there's another line of research going on. Primatologists have been following baboons, troops of animals, for generations of the animals and generations of the scientists, actually, following them and basically recording exactly what each one did, to whom, who was around. They're like glorified gossip columnists, right? But they weren't thinking about friendship. They were thinking about all kinds of other things. But they were aware of this research in humans that was showing these risks of isolation and loneliness. And then something happened. So meet Sylvia. She's a baboon who lived in Botswana. I'm sorry to say that Sylvia was actually pretty nasty. She was a piece of work. She hung out primarily with her daughter, Sierra, who was her primary grooming partner. And then a sad thing happened. Sierra was eaten by a lion, which is something that happens to baboons that live in Africa. And Sylvia did something odd. She started trying to be friendly and make friends with the other animals for the first time in her life, it seemed. This surprised the primatologists. Presumably, it surprised the other baboons as well. They were pretty suspicious. But it got the scientists thinking, what would be in it for Sylvia that she would change a lifetime of being grumpy and try to find somebody new to hang out with? And so what they did was they took the years of data that they had gathered, and they essentially created a measure of how nice the baboons were to each other. And that allowed them to take this social index, this index of sociability, and measure it against two things: reproductive success, so how many babies you had and how long they lived, and longevity. And what they found was that it wasn't dominance hierarchy, which they imagined. Baboons live in a very, very hierarchical society, and Sylvia, by the way, was at the top of it. They expected that to matter most. It didn't. What mattered most was the baboons with the best friends, with the strong social bonds. They lived longer, and they had more and healthier babies. And in evolutionary terms, we can't do better than that, than longevity and reproductive success. It's what we're all after. So this means that there has been a survival of the friendliest. Now, it's true, there are some successful jerks out there, but by and large, our best bet is to be nice and to make friends. And those of us who do tend to live longer and be happier. So there are real evolutionary advantages to being good at making and maintaining friends. So why? Because if something is of evolutionary advantage, there's something going on that makes it, worth doing. So what would friendship and social relationships be doing? It makes, it's intuitive that what we eat, we put things in our body so we can understand why that would affect our health. If we're exercising, our heart is pumping, our muscles are working, we feel like, okay, yeah, I can see why this might affect how healthy I am. But friendships exist outside the body, over here. How do they get under the skin and affect our cells and change our health? Well, we have some answers. Not all, but a bunch. So those early researchers who were following all those thousands of people, they thought that something called social support was at work. And that is the idea that if you happen to have a friend, like Lonnie has Sharon, who is an ear to listen, is someone a shoulder to cry on, maybe bring you a casserole if you need it, someone to drive you to the hospital should you need to go, to notice that you need to go to the hospital even. That's one reason why people who live alone are at greater risk. They thought that explained it. And social support is real and it matters, But here's the thing, baboons don't drive each other to the hospital or anywhere else, and yet they also live longer if they have good, positive bonds. And so something else is going on, something deeper. What we know now is that the psychological is biological. So loneliness is a psychological state that gets into our bodies and changes our biology. And friendship is essentially a symbol of that fundamental need to belong and to connect. And so it too gets into our bodies and changes our health. And they do it, both of them, in a whole lot of ways. So friendship for the good, loneliness for ill. They affect our cardiovascular functioning, our heart rate, blood pressure, our risk of dementia, our risk of depression, the quality of our sleep. They affect in our immune system the way the genes are expressed in our white blood cells that make us more or less susceptible to viruses, COVID, and inflammation. So lonely people are more susceptible, and people with more friends are more resilient. It affects our stress responses. That's one of the ways in which these other things happen in the body. It even affects the rate at which our cells age. So we have little caps called telomeres on the ends of our chromosomes, and they get shorter over time as we all get older. In lonely people, the telomeres get shorter faster. So that explains, probably all of these things together help explain why we are at more risk of dying earlier if we are lonely. And these things, some of these things happen in the short term, the way you have a bad night's sleep if you had a tough day. Maybe if you felt hurt by a friend, you would feel some emotional pain about it. But some of them happen over the long haul. So I know Lonnie was friends with John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago. He's one of the premier social psychologists who figured out that loneliness was as important as it is. And what he and his colleagues did was look at young college students, lonely college students, and they were able to see warning signs in their cardiovascular system. So for those who want the specifics, something called total peripheral resistance, which is a primary determinant of blood pressure. It was higher in the lonely college students than it was in people who weren't lonely. And then when Cacioppo's team went and studied older adults, they found that those warning signs in the blood pressure had turned into high blood pressure, right? So over time, there's a cumulative effect. The upshot of that is that friendship is as important as diet and health, as diet and exercise for our health over the long haul. Now you might wonder, what do I mean by friendship, and what do these scientists mean by friendship? One reason why it wasn't studied for a long time or taken very seriously is because it's a little squishy and ephemeral. Feels that way. So here's the definition. A friend helps you move, a good friend helps you move a body. It's a pretty famous proverb, and it does get at something fundamental, right, about how the loyalty that friendship engenders in people. And in fact, there's a fascinating study across countries that found that your willingness to lie for a friend increases with the political and economic instability of the country you live in. But short of covering up a murder, there has to be a better way to define friendship. One of my favorite ways is a study by developmental psychologists of 3-year-old kids. And they asked them, what is a good friend? If you asked kids here, what are the youngest kids? 5? Is it K? Starts with K? 3? Okay. 2. Oh, 2. Okay. So if you asked them, what's a good friend? What these kids said was, a friend plays with you, a friend shares with you, and a friend doesn't hit you. Which, really, out of the mouths of babes is a pretty good definition of friendship, right? But biologists wanted to pin it down better than that. And so one of the things they did was look in these other species, like I've mentioned, because there you can strip out some of the complex variables of human life. And they found that a strong social bond, aka friendship, required 3 minimum things. They were long-lasting, they were positive, and they were cooperative. And all the other things that we tend to use, if you ask people to define friendship, they will talk about trust and loyalty and fun and companionship. It's all there, but it fits, I think, in these three things: long-lasting, positive, and cooperative. And an anthropologist went and studied friendship in hundreds of cultures around the world, and he found very similar universal themes. So while there were a lot of differences, most often people said friendship makes you feel good, so it's positive, and it involves a willingness to help, especially in times of need, which is the cooperative part. The thing that turned up in humans that doesn't turn up in other animals is gift giving. So at first I thought, really? Are we humans so shallow that we have to give gifts to our friends? But it turns out that those gifts often are not of much material value. The point is not in the value of the gift, it's a way of marking the value of the relationship, which is something to keep in mind as the holiday season is approaching. So let's talk now about kids, friendship and children. Because now, kids, of course, don't necessarily have long-lasting friendships. They're just getting going, but what we want to do is allow them to build those friendships and give them the skills that they need to do it. Humans come into the world predisposed to be social, but we're a little underdone, right? It has to do with being able to, for human women to be able to give birth, the baby needs to be a little bit undercooked, and babies are not actually very social for the first 3 months of life, and then something magical happens. You get social gaze, and mutual gaze and a social smile. And those two things are seen as the baby's entry into the social world, because essentially being social means doing something that has an effect on somebody else. And that's what the baby has now done, and that's why we parents melt all over again when they're 3 months old or beyond, and it smiled and it's not just gas, right? And in those first few years of life, we are the parents and caregivers are the primary social partners, and everything we do is helping to build the social skills of these kids. Baby is not being tortured, I swear. This is something called FNIRS, which is near infrared spectroscopy. So it allows them to look at the blood flow inside the baby's brain. It's non-invasive. This is the work of neuroscientists in the UK. And what they have found is that there is a very clear progression over the first 1,000 days of life. That's roughly 3 years, right? We come into the world with a preference for faces and voices, and it just grows and grows and grows and grows over those first 3 years. There is a clear specialization in the brain in the finer points of being social. And of course, it continues after that, but they're interested in looking at what's going on in babies. And what is striking is you can see the difference between a baby born on Monday and a baby born on Thursday. The one born on Thursday is more social. The other thing that's important to point out is that they've also looked at babies who then go on to be diagnosed with autism. And one of the things, I skipped something. Okay, so importantly, one of the things that's happening in those 3 years is that their response to social signals like an adult playing peekaboo that you see here is what is increasing, right? And they respond differently to social signals than they do to static non-social things like cars and trucks, even if those cars and trucks are moving. What the kids with autism do is respond to the cars and trucks more similarly than they do. They're not as interested in the social signals. So all of that time, what's happening is that the social brain is being built in these kids, and it's no one place in the brain. In fact, it's almost all of the brain is involved in being social, which is kind of makes it amazing that we didn't start studying this earlier. We were interested in cognition and memory and learning, but the social parts of the brain, it's like 3/4 of the brain. So it's your auditory system, your visual system, your language abilities, your emotional stuff, your ability to mentalize. So this is, the point is it's all connected. Neurons talking to each other in our brains, that's what's happening all the time. It's what's happening in my brain, it's what's happening in your brain as you're listening to me. And the point is that it's all connected and that it's a network, right? and there's no one center, but all of it, those circuits, I'm sure most of you are familiar that what is happening in early childhood is that we're growing extra neurons and then pairing them back depending on what gets used. And they are learning how to be social. Now, one of the things that's been studied is empathy. In the last 15 to 20 years, neuroscientists started realizing that there was a neuroscience of empathy, but it's not one thing like we normally think it is. They think it's an umbrella term for three things, three components. The first is pretty basic. It's like a bodily response to something going on with somebody else, right? So like, if you're watching your child play a sport or perform in a recital and you start to sweat. So this is my youngest son, Alex, playing basketball last year, and up there in the top left corner, that's me freaking out. I have to drink water the whole time. I get a dry mouth watching him play. My heart races, all those things, right? And now he's playing college ball, so I got 4 more years of this. I'm learning. You'd think, he's 19, that I'd be better at it, but I'm not. I think a lot of other parents probably relate to that. It doesn't have to be a parent-child thing, but that's a bodily empathy. The next is perspective taking. It's the ability to recognize that somebody else has thoughts and emotions that are different from yours, that their view on the world is different from yours. And then the last part is compassion or empathic concern. Different scientists call it different things, but what it really is not only the ability to recognize that somebody else thinks something differently than you do, but to care and to be motivated to do something about it. It's kind of the last thing, well, it's not actually the last thing to come online. Sometimes even 2-year-olds will be like, Mommy, don't cry, or whatever it is, you know. That's the beginnings of that kind of empathy. So empathy is fundamental for friendship. It lays the groundwork. It's what allows kids and adults to have social relationships, but it's not the only skill that kids need. Friendship is essentially a set of social skills. This is one of the most important messages I want to leave you with. So we need to build empathy, but kids need to learn to read social cues, to know if somebody is excited or bored or a little freaked out by something you did. They need to set boundaries. They need to manage their emotions, learn how to self-regulate, right? All these things require practice. The same way Alex has to practice his 3-point shot, kids have to practice being social and developing these skills. Back to these guys. What does friendship mean for kids? You remember I said there are 3, and they had a pretty concrete picture of what a friend is. A friend plays with you, shares with you, and doesn't hit you, which is good as it goes, right? It's true. But what happens as we get older is that evolves. Kids play, they learn a lot of those social skills through play, and play is fundamentally important for kids' development. We understand, just like we now understand that friendship is more valuable than we thought, we also understand that play is more valuable than we thought. So Stuart Brown wrote a book called Play. It was a massive bestseller, and he helped us to start to take play seriously. And he called it a profound biological process. It shapes the brain, it fosters empathy, it promotes survival, all kinds of things. And just like friendship, one of the things we know about play is that it helps a lot of different species to survive and to thrive. And that's how we understand that it is as important as it is. But what kids do is, after they've learned certain amount of being social with us, then they go to school and they start to learn other things from their peers that they can't actually learn from their parents. There's a different kind of trust and loyalty that comes along. There's the ability to give support and not just receive it. There is a need to learn the rules of social engagement, the rules of childhood, and operating in larger circles. And all of that starts to happen in those early years of school. And there's a longstanding model for how kids make friends. So they start by doing similar activities side by side. So do adults, by the way. We start by hanging out, doing the same thing, and then often there's a shared emotional experience that comes from it, like maybe the way kids on a soccer team, let's say they win and then they're all excited. They feel a little more bonded, right? So those emotional experiences help deepen our relationships over time. And then what happens is, as kids get older, the playing turns into hanging out, the sharing turns into helping, and the not hitting turns into trust and loyalty and other ways of being pro-social with each other, right? And the thing about adolescence is that, and we're going to get into this, but when friendship is good in adolescence, it is very, very good. It feels so wonderful, right? And actually, everything in adolescence that feels good feels better than how it feels for us adults. And that's actually not just imagined, that's in their brains. It's why our memories from that period of life are so much stronger sometimes than our memories of other periods of time. And so friendship is amazing. Equally, the pain of exclusion is horrifying, and especially when we are young. I'm going to make a little plug for sleepovers. I have a reputation as the video game and sleepover person. Kids love me, parents not so much, but I'm going to say it. I think sleepovers, and I say this as a parent who, my joke was that the 5 words I hated most hearing as a parent were, "Can we have a sleepover?" Unless, obviously fire, blood, hospitals, that was all bad. That was worse. But other than that, I did not like hosting sleepovers. But I really see that what sleepovers do is give kids unstructured, it's one of the last places where they have unstructured time to hang out. And I know that people have different rules and different concerns. I tried to have those things at my house so that I could get to know the other kids and so that I had control, but also because I knew it was important. My kids, my youngest especially, different kids have different desires. My youngest endlessly wanted to have sleepovers with his friends. And I think that there's all that practice I was talking about. A lot of that happens in unstructured hanging out. So let's talk a little bit more about adolescence. If we want to understand friendship in adolescence, we have to understand the adolescent brain. And the really important thing to know, maybe you know this, but for neuroscientists, adolescence begins at 10 and goes all the way to 25. So it's not just 13 to 19. It begins with the very first parts of puberty, and it takes all the way until your mid-20s for your brain to be fully matured. I had dinner with my 24-year-old last night. I was like, "You're still not done." But he thinks he is, right? That's always the issue, and we come to that. Just like I said, there's been a surge in the neuroscience of empathy. There's been a massive change in our understanding of the adolescent brain. So just like I said, there are a whole lot of neurons being developed in very young children. There's a second wave of neurons being added and then pruned back in adolescence. And we did not used to think that. We used to think it stopped around about 3. And one of the things that's happening with those changes in the brain is that the parts of the brain that control emotion are outrunning, are developing faster. They're sort of leaping ahead in the parts of the brain that control judgment and reason and all those other good things. And so there's this, so a chart looks like that, and the gap right there, that's adolescence, right? And so it explains perfectly the risk-taking that is a big part of adolescence. It also explains why the way kids feel about their friends is so, so powerful. They will never be more sensitive to social acceptance and rejection than in adolescence. They are aware suddenly of the social environment and cues in the environment that they used to just not even notice, right? And now suddenly they care. That is literally a change in the brain, in what the brain is paying attention to. They also, I'd like to point this out because there's some really wonderful work coming out, mostly of UCLA and Berkeley, on how much kids also need to feel, they have a need to contribute and to find meaning and purpose in life. And that's something that we can support as the adults in their lives. And we don't always appreciate how much they care about that. All of this is evolution at work. This is kids learning to be independent, right? I mean, this, I'm sure you know this. This is not big news now, but what's happening in adolescence is that kids are needing to move away from their family and comfort, and they're needing to go out in the world and interact with friends. That's who they're going to need to rely on in addition to their families. Two extra things I wanted to point out that I think is two of the most interesting things to me that I have discovered in my research on adolescent development. Some of this came post working on the friendship book. We know all the things puberty does, but there's even more. So there's something called social buffering, which is a phenomenon where the presence of another person helps calm down your stress, right? So in young children, their mothers are usually who gets studied with this. Literally, and the way they, do y'all know how psychologists test for stress? Public speaking. It's the number one, it's the constant thing that they test. That and having to do math problems out loud. Those are the two things that universally stress people out. So they make kids give a little speech, little kids, and if their mom is around, she can literally bring down the cortisol levels. Puberty happens? Not anymore. It's not that we don't help them. It's not that like our parents can't help, but literally the way one scientist put it to me, we are no longer in their hypothalamus. We were, and puberty we're not. Now the theory was that friends take over, and some studies do find that, but the same scientist, Megan Gunner, in Minnesota, who told me about the hypothalamus, she tested very specifically whether your adolescent friends, I think the kids were 14 to 17, whether they could reduce your cortisol level when you had to give a speech. And they actually increased it, which at first she was surprised, and then she said that makes perfect sense because they are so sensitive to social acceptance and rejection and having to give a speech. I think the speech that they did in the study was like you had to give a speech about why you are a good friend. And in retrospect, she's like, that was not the right thing to ask them to do. So this is one reason why science is evolving and it changes, right, what we know. Anyway, the jury's out on exactly what we do know about adults is that the presence of a friend can calm us down. It can make a challenge that we're looking at look less daunting. So there is a shift and friends are becoming more important. Where exactly is interesting. And then the last thing I want to talk about is autonomy and respect. So a bunch of psychologists were trying to figure out how come these interventions we do to try to help kids eat better or stop bullying or be more interested in math, like the things that they did for kids in elementary school would seem to work, like telling them why, it's better to eat fruits and vegetables than junk food. That would have an effect. And then 8th grade, puberty, boom, no, not anymore. And what they found was that they had to change the intervention. So for food, what they did was they changed it to a discussion and sharing information about how food companies work and how they target teenagers sometimes, and some information about the ingredients that they use and what they know about it and versus what they say about it. And the kids were pissed. They said, well, they're taking advantage of us. We don't want to be patronized. We don't want to be. And then they made amazingly healthy choices in the cafeteria for the next 3 months. So what those researchers did was appeal to this change in autonomy and respect. The reason I wanted to share that is because I think it is so critical for adults thinking about the social lives of our kids that we care about and understanding that we have to change how we talk to them about it right around this time, right? 6th grade is where a lot of these changes happen, middle school, puberty is starting, but also kids really do start to develop a different sense of their own identity, of where they fit in the world, or they're working on it in a new way. Their interests start to develop, more specialized interests, right? So often the kids who you were friends with when you were younger, suddenly, my Alex, the basketball player, his best friend, in the early years then became really, really fascinated with classical music and composition, and Alex became a really serious basketball player. It wasn't that they weren't friends anymore, but they just didn't spend very much time together. So some of that is natural, that friendships grow up around these new shared interests, and that's okay. The truth about 6th grade, so researchers at UCLA followed 6,000 students starting at 6th grade, and what they found was that 2/3 of them changed friends between September and June of 6th grade. 2/3, right? And here's the thing, those kids all think it's just them, right? This is another place where adults can really make a difference. Now, one reason for this is it's a byproduct of the American public school system, where kids are moving from an elementary school to a middle school to a high school, and so who's around them can change some, usually not entirely, but some, versus kids who grow up through one, like here, if they go all the way through 8th grade in the same place. Maybe there's a little less of this, but also what is at work is that changing in who they are, their sense of themselves, their shared identities, their interests change around this time. So I think it's critical that we tell kids how normal this is, and actually that we recognize, I think there's a little bit of like a microcosm, it's our adult lives in, what's the word I want? It's a mirror of our adult lives, because if you think about all the friends you've had in your life, some of them are the same, but a bunch have changed circumstantially or whatever it is, and that's actually not the end of the world as long as there are a few good people in there. But there is a dark side, of course. 12% of those 6,000 sixth graders in that UCLA study had no one who named them as a friend. And that reciprocity of friendship, both of you naming the other, is a really important piece of it. And those kids are lonely. And what's interesting is that that's not good in the moment, but it actually can take a little bit of time for those effects to show up. So what they found is that kids who were lonely in 6th grade, in 7th grade, they seem to indicate a sense of threat, which is what loneliness actually is in the brain, is this fear of being excluded from the group. And it wasn't until 8th grade that you started to see signs of internalizing difficulties like anxiety and depression. So this is one reason why adults need to pay attention from the start, is we actually have a chance to intervene and help, because it takes a little time. I also wanted to say a few things about temperament and personality. Everyone sort of assumes that what I'm saying is everyone has to be extroverted. That is not what I'm saying. It's all good. There's no one way to do friendship. There's a big range of normal. There's outside of normal, but the range of normal is wide. Extrovert, as long as introverted people often are more interested in just a few good relationships, and that's great. That's actually, you'll see in a minute, that's super helpful. And extroverted people, as long as they also have some people that they are closer to, do really well. So importantly, popularity is not the same thing as friendship. And that's something that I want parents to really understand. So what matters for kids' health is having those few close friendships. And in fact, so here Jake and Christian again. Now they were classic best friends, but my other boys didn't have one best friend all the way through for 20 years. They've had sort of shifting groups, and they've had a best friend most of the time, but not always. So that's not what matters. But what does matter is having some close friends is the most important thing. So a UVA study in 2019 followed, I think it was 164 15-year-olds, and then they followed them for 10 years. And what they found was that those who had at least one close friend at 15 were had increased self-worth and lower levels of depression and anxiety 10 years later at 25. And by contrast, the people who were really all about being popular but less focused on having a good friend or two were more likely to suffer social anxiety as young adults. So quality matters most for all of us. Quantity is not unimportant. It has some other benefits. It's great to have a diverse friend group and all kinds of things. But if you're going to ask me what I care about most, it's that you have one, just one really good friend. A word about peer presence. And I say peer presence very intentionally. We talk about peer pressure, but in fact, it's not all bad. So peer pressure implies that it's bad. So what matters is who kids are hanging out with, but the presence, and we've established already that the presence of peers is really important. It's really rewarding in the brain. In fact, at Temple University showed very clearly that adolescents who that know their friends are watching, even if they can't even see them in the room, they will take more risk. The more reward in their brain from knowing their friends are there, the more risk they will take. And it is not just human beings. Adolescent mice take more risks if their adolescent peers are around. They will press more on a little bar to get more alcohol because they like the sugar in the alcohol. So obviously the presence of friends is important, but sometimes it is a force for good. So if your child hangs out with somebody who's a serious student or a serious athlete or something like that, and they can be influenced by that just as much as they can something bad. However, adolescents are also 4 times more likely to crash the car if there's somebody else in it, whereas adults are safer drivers when there are other people in the car. And we know that adolescents are more likely to try alcohol and drugs for the first time when they are with their friends. So who they are hanging out with is a critical question for adults to know. Also, where are they hanging out? Online, in person? The best thing is mixing it up, actually. Our offline lives tend to mirror our online lives a little bit. What's interesting to me is that we, historically, as a society, we have always gotten really freaked out about big technological changes. This has been a huge one. It's seismic, and so no wonder we're worried. But the thing that is important to know is that a lot of the early science about the effects of social media and well-being really just looked at screen time, and we know now that that is not a very meaningful concept. The pandemic certainly brought that home because all we had was technology to connect with people, and so we were more about celebrating what was good about it. And it actually, by the way, helped the science leap forward from this. So now they're asking questions like, how much better does a Zoom call feel better versus a phone call, or things like that, which nobody was paying to study that before. What the researchers who study this really, really care about is not the time online, but content and context. So who are kids talking to and what are they doing? All right, there's a really big difference, we think, between Zooming with grandma and playing Grand Theft Auto, watching pornography, and studying for your history paper, researching your history paper. So what you're doing matters a lot more than the amount of time that you're doing it. And I just want to point out, there has been some really new, important, rigorous science, much more rigorous, that helps to say that the hysteria is a little overblown. So this is a study that came out in 2019 from Oxford University. And what they did was look at data on 350,000 adolescents. And they had really rich data sets that had a lot of information about these kids' lives. And so what they were trying to do was show how much did any one thing account for the variability in well-being in these kids. And technology use was bad. It's purple. It's that second bar from the bottom. It was negative, but it was less than 0.5% of the variation. It accounted for less than 0.5% of the variation in well-being in these kids. Worse, wearing glasses, which I do. Got my contacts in now, but riding a bicycle regularly was almost twice as good for kids, right? Being bullied is terrible. Getting a really good breakfast and a lot of sleep is much, much, much more powerfully positive than social media is negative. So what I think this tells us is that we need to see the forest for the trees. We need to understand that there are a lot of different things going on in kids' lives. And one of the things that researchers are beginning to do is zero in on who's at risk. Because this is at a population level. So there are kids who are at risk with social media use, but they tend to be kids who have some issues already, and it's amplified by social media. So I think we're going to learn more in the science by zeroing in on what matters. Could do a whole talk about this, but we don't have time for that. Last thing I'll say, obviously I started with video games. What I now understand is just how social they are. So the Pew Research Center says 97% of boys play video games and 83% of girls. 3/4 of them play with somebody else, either in the room or over an online connection. And so that's just a piece. I am not an evangelist for video games, but I do think that parents need to understand that this is not kids sitting alone. It is maybe that's cause for concern, right? More so than if this is the way that they interact. How can we help? Adults want to help. I put communicate 3 times, partly for emphasis, but also because I see it as 3 different ways that we can communicate. One is about their social relationships. We want to gather information from them about what's going on in their world, and sometimes we have to be a little indirect about it. They may not tell us, right away. You got to put them all in the car. Who else was amazed by how a group of kids in a car will forget that the parent is there driving the car, and they will say a lot. And I remember one birthday party carpool very, very vividly where I thought, now that kid Caleb is a really great kid. That other kid, whose name I'm not going to say, I don't want him hanging out anymore. And that was really useful information for me, and they would never have told me that directly, right? So we do our work as parents trying to gather that information. Sometimes we should be also communicating about friendship in our own lives. We need to model that it matters. We need to talk about our friends, show that we spend time with them, and we're not always ignoring our friends at the expense in order to be with our families. It's not that our families don't matter, but what message are you sending your kid if you never, ever go out with your friends, right? And then we need to communicate about friendship in general. And so, for instance, it's not that you can't ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? Although I think most kids are sick of it. But what about asking, what kind of friend would you like to be? Or what do you like best about your friends? What about having a conversation about friendship in more fundamental ways? And we can have conversations about the pieces of friendship, like empathy, if we catch kids being kind, not just little kids necessarily, but big kids too. And with my big kids, I sometimes play this game. I don't know if you've heard about this exercise where you are the average or the reflection of your 5 closest friends. It's kind of an interesting game to play. And I think for kids, it's an indirect way of getting them to understand that who they hang out with does kind of help determine who they are, and that sometimes that's not a great thing. And if they can get there themselves, that's much better than if you had to tell them. I want you to think about sharing statistics, skills, and thinking about situations. So the statistics, some of them I've already given you. If you read the book, you'll find lots more. But how many people wouldn't like to know in 6th grade that 2/3 of kids are changing friends, right? That fact alone is really great and useful. I used to write a blog for Psychology Today. The #1 most popular thing I ever wrote was about this study about the time it takes to make a friend. 50 hours of time together to go from an acquaintance to a friend, 80 to 90 hours to become a good friend, and 200 hours to consider someone a best friend. Now that was done in college students and in adults, so not little kids, but still, kids have an advantage over adults actually because they spend a lot of time together. College students do everything together, right? But the message is it does take time, right? And we adults need to know that. It's one reason why it's so hard to make new friends in adulthood. You just don't naturally get to spend all that much time together. People like you more than you think. Psychologists have found this endlessly. So we go into things with a lot of anxiety, not always necessary. And like I said, it's great if you have more friends, but if you're going to ask me how many friends do you have, you only need 1. And your kid only needs 1. And so if your stress is that your kid is not popular or that they should maybe you should sign them up for flag football or something because that's what everybody's doing. The question to ask is, will they like flag football? Will they be good at flag football? Because if they won't, it doesn't matter, and it's much better that they spend their time with that one kid, maybe making a book club or playing chess or doing whatever it is. The skills I already talked about, but just thinking about how friendship is a set of social skills. And while I'm on it, that definition I gave you, long-lasting, positive, cooperative, I think it gives us a guide for how to be a good friend. It means to be a steady, reliable presence, to show up. It means to be positive, to be kind, and to talk to our friends about how much we appreciate them every once in a while. And it means to be helpful, to reciprocate, to notice, to listen, all those good things in adults and in kids. And then the last thing is the situations. So friendships grow out of shared interests, I've already said. They grow out of proximity. That's not automatic. You can think about all the people you've worked with over the years that you never really became friends with. Time gets you something. It isn't automatic, but it's a head start. So put kids in situations where they're likely to find people that they like. Try really hard to understand what your kid is actually interested in. Kids need to work on that themselves. They need to understand that they can keep looking, they can try different things and until they find their people are out there. And I have advice from a child psychiatrist in New York City who I really think highly of. And one of the things she told me that is a red flag is for parents who are really worried about a child's social life, they should be looking across situations. So do they struggle at school but do great at camp or do just fine with their cousins at holiday parties? Then that's less of a concern, and you should be looking more at what's going on in school, what's the culture, who are the kids. If they're struggling absolutely everywhere socially, then that does usually indicate that a professional help would be a good idea. I'm going to give you one last statistic. So I told you already that it matters where you are at 15 affects where you are at 25. There was a pretty famous study at Harvard that followed more than 700 men, and they were all men because it started in the early part of the 20th century, followed them for the course of their whole lives. And so when those that got into their 80s got there, they were able to look back and see what predicted who was happy and healthy at 80. It wasn't cholesterol level, it wasn't professional success, wealth. It was how satisfied the men were with their relationships at 50. So, if we want ourselves, our kids, to grow up to be like these ladies, I have a picture of them over my desk, kicking up our heels, having a great time with our friends, we need to remember that friendship is a lifelong endeavor, that it is a set of skills that can be perfected, that it is a muscle that has to be worked, and that it starts here. Early, and that we as parents and adults in kids' lives need to keep friendship in mind in the classroom, at home. We need to nurture it, value it for ourselves, model it, and talk about it more than we do. And that is it. Thank you so much, and I am